Yes, hello. It's Jason Louv. Welcome back to the Ultra Culture podcast. We've got a very special treat today. I am joined by the author Ian Cutler, who began his writing career focusing on the Cynic school of philosophy, but moved on to write several books documenting his profound passion for tramping and tramps. That is the phenomenon of people throughout the 19th and early part of the 20th century who turned their back on society and decided to basically go feral, riding the rails and living lives of grand adventure and romance and danger and often misery, but most of all, freedom from industrial society. Something that you've maybe thought about from time to time. I definitely have. Sometimes it is tempting to just think about leaving it all behind. And well, we get to hear about the people who did exactly that in this very interesting interview. And before we dive in, I of course want to share with you the latest on something that's got everyone very, very excited. That's our new tarot course at magick.me. You can find it at tarot.magick.me, tarotmagick.me. It's taught by the world-renowned author and magician Lon Milo Duquette. It's a deep dive journey of transformation that reveals the mysteries of the entire universe through the art of tarot. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear from some of the students who have already taken the course, because some great reviews are already starting to file in. People are diving straight into it and letting us know how excited they are. So Jim Horrocks, who's a longtime student at the site, says, "So much information. It's an amazing deep dive. My autistic brain is delightfully swimming in all the content. Well done." Thank you very much, Jim. Tanya Lee Wild also says, "I just signed up, so very excited for the adventure ahead. I absolutely cherish Lon's books." And another student who goes by just the name Observing shares, "I started the course this week, and it is nothing short of phenomenal. Not only does Lon provide exceedingly powerful insight, but the humor and lightheartedness of his lecturing makes it very comfortable and approachable." Thank you very much, Jim, Tanya Lee Wild, and Observing. And even Alan Moore, the author of Watchmen, From Hell, V for Vendetta. Yes, that Alan Moore. He hasn't taken the course, but he does love Lon Duquette's work in general. And he did say at one point, again, not about this course, but about the teacher of this course, to get the flavor of Magick, you could do a lot worse than read a couple of the books by Lon Milo Duquette. Well, this isn't just a book. This is a full immersive course that gives you everything you need to know to master the tarot, which is not just a deck of cards for divining the future, but the true book of magic of the Western esoteric tradition. So join us for the Magic of Tarot course with Lon Milo Duquette. Again, you can find it at tarot.magick.me, tarotmagick.me. All right, let's dive straight into our conversation with Ian Cutler. Thank you so much for being on the show. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and hobos, your subject matter that you've spent so much time on.
Well, my first book was about Cynicism, the ancient Greek philosophy and its legatees right up to the present day. And it was kind of, so I kind of got interested in tramps and hobos via Cynicism, the philosophy, and because there's so many similarities, and they're both outsiders. They both kind of challenge conformity and they were like traveling. They both didn't. Neither of them believed that education was like the sort of formal education, like schools and universities, was the way adults should learn. They believed people should experience things through their own senses and just being in the world and all the rest of it. So I started that book on Cynicism. Well, that was 2005, I think that one was published. And then I got really interested in modern day or relatively modern day, because we're going back 100 years.
So what maybe just define briefly, what is the actual philosophy of cynicism? Because obviously people know the word, but may not know the Greek philosophy. Just maybe just a paragraph worth, so we can have that reference point when talking about hobos.
Yeah, basically, it's more of an anti-philosophy than a philosophy, if anything. The Western civilization, as I understand it, started around the time of Socrates, and the Cynics and Plato and Aristotle, they were all about at the same time. They all went to the same meetings and schools and what have you. And there was kind of like a battle for Socrates' inheritance, in as much as the Cynics, he never wrote anything down, like Jesus, whether you believe Jesus is fictional or real or whatever, doesn't matter. That's by the way. But so everything was interpreted by other people, and they just were kind of like I said, they believed in they led a very ascetic lifestyle, like a lot of the tramps and hobos. They believed that we were imprisoned by the possessions and things like family and home and jobs, work, all that kind of thing, just kept people kind of prisoners of their own in their own life and unable to, I suppose, be free, experience the joys of nature and what have you. And so that's the similarity.
That's so interesting. I mean, I don't know if this was Stoicism Greek or was that Roman later?
Yeah, that was Stoicism kind of came around the same time as Cynicism, but it was one of the Hellenistic philosophies.
That's really interesting.
Epicureanism, hedonism, Cynicism, Stoicism, they were all philosophies kind of based on people's experiences of the world around them, rather than being taught by somebody who claimed to know better.
Got it. Yeah, that's really interesting because you probably are aware, Stoicism has had a resurgence, particularly in America with the tech industry. People love Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius for some reason. And it's become incredibly popular. I'm not exactly sure why, but Cynicism is interesting to me. I haven't heard it defined that way. It sounds to me like sadhus in India or something like that, or people who are just dropping out of society.
It probably has a basis in Buddhism, because the Buddha was around about 100 years before, the time of the Cynics, and Alexander the Great's kind of wars and trips across to India and all the rest of it brought all that kind of information back. So basically, the tenets of Cynicism are very similar to that of Buddhism, which is, if you don't have anything, you're not going to miss anything. So
that is so interesting.
Put you down,
That's so interesting. I mean, I've been seeing more news articles that Buddhism are kind of like the interplay between Buddhism and ancient Greece, and that there have been Buddha statues found in Greece, which is just completely, at least for me, changes the model of what I was taught in school.
Yeah, well, a lot of formal academics, and Greek philosophers as well, don't want Buddhists to claim any part of their own history, their own philosophy. But in fact, a lot of those Hellenistic philosophies came from, their contact with Buddhists. And
that's huge. That right there changes my whole worldview. And it's like, that kind of in a way invalidates this whole thing of Western versus Eastern civilization, if the back and forth is that old. And also, I'd kind of always been under the impression that the quote unquote Western civilization only started getting exposed to Eastern ideas like in the 1700s or something like that. But in fact, there seems to be also evidence that whoever the historical Jesus person was, that he was in contact with Mahayana Buddhism, because the New Testament is basically Mahayana Buddhism. And what you're saying now is blowing my mind. I haven't heard that. I only heard the thing about statues in Greece, but that's That's a massive mental shift for me, even to think that Buddhist philosophy was involved in ancient Greek philosophy and Socrates and things like that. That's huge.
Yes, but not in terms of Platonism and Aristotelianism. Those philosophers, that philosophy, which is based on first principles, which is that there are basic truths in the world, and you have to learn them and understand them and teach them and pass them on to other people. But that has dominated Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. And that's basically the model that exists today. So the Cynics, like the Tramps, like, if you like, if there was a historical Jesus, his philosophy, which is completely at odds with Christianity. I mean, you think about all these fat bishops in their purple robes and gold chains in their cathedral palaces.
Yes.
What the hell's that got to do with, rich man can't go to heaven and all the rest of it?
Yeah, it's got a lot more to do with St. Paul.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there we are then.
Yeah.
So, so basically that's how I got into the whole thing with the hobos and the tramps. There are differences. There are subtle differences because the people the 15 tramp writers that I discuss in my book with Feral House, they're all people who, first of all, they all wrote down the first-hand accounts of their own life and their own philosophies. That was one of the criteria. I wanted to get first-hand knowledge of how these people live. So all of them wrote them, but they were first and foremost, they were tramp who wrote. They weren't people from the literary world who tramped. And there's a lot of folk like that, who share similar lifestyle and views to the people I wrote about, the tramps I wrote about, but they were writers first and foremost, and a lot of them were fairly comfortable middle class writers as well. They had money and they had homes, permanent homes.
Are you talking about like the beat writers or?
Oh no! Before that, like Robert Louis Stevenson and kind of people who were writing at the end of they were writing about the same time as the guys I wrote about, which is the late 1800s, early 1900s.
The only writer I was going to ask about that I know from this genre is Jack Black, who wrote You Can't Win, who I know because William Burroughs always wrote about him as his kind of primary first inspiration. Was he as you put it, a tramp who wrote?
Yes, he was a tramp who wrote rather than it was Emily Burbank was a writer who was a friend of Josiah Flint, who was one of the other writers I write about. And she said, that was her definition, that he was the tramp writer, not the literary man tramping. And that's the kind of criteria I used. And yes, he was very much in that mold, but he was probably also one of the few who was a professional criminal. So in the lingo of the time, the hobo, they described. I mean, guys like Jack Black were described as yeggs. They were like, they were tramps. They were hobos, but they had a criminal lifestyle. But he still had the same kind of philosophy about life. He had the same lifestyle. He lived that simple kind of life where he didn't trap himself down with material things, although he, and it was the criminality was more of a lifestyle thing,
Got it.
With him.
So when you began to explore this subject matter, what was it that you found? I mean, was it a clear through line from the Cynic philosophy to hobos and tramps, or like what was the world that you discovered and that compelled you so much to focus on it so much? What was it that drew you in, and what were maybe tell us about some of these people and their stories?
Yeah, I mean, well, most of them. And I've just written another book, which I'm trying to get published at the moment, because somebody asked me the question, well, you've written a biography about all these guys. You've written about their adventures, their lives. But what was it that made them, what were the common factors, the kind of philosophical factors? And the one is wanderlust. That's one of the main things, is that they couldn't keep still. They had to be on the move all the time. And the actual momentum of walking and moving all the time is what kind of kept them going, kept them alive almost. So they needed to move. They be on the move all the time, and so that's one aspect of it. The other side of it is this whole thing about education, and not, that formal education, kind of almost like even they wanted to just learn for themselves and discover for themselves. So anyway, about 50% of those guys, or more than 50% of the guys I wrote about were child tramps. They left home, some as young as 7 or 8 even, and took to the road, various reasons. Some of those were from kind of comfortable middle-class families, but they just had this urge to just go, get away from their families, just be on the move. So they, jump in trains and all the rest of it. But what's interesting is that in America, there were some major factors that triggered the whole kind of like explosion in tramping and hoboism, which was the American Civil War. And when the Civil War ended, there were all these people who were used to marching, or long walk, not having a regular home, not having, they were used to that, and they found it very hard to settle back into normal society after the wars. Then there were the 3 depressions in America in the 1880s, 90s, and then later on in the 1930s, that created this need for people to move around, to look for work. So there were thousands of tramps out there wandering around, and also one of the factors all these guys have in common is their obsession with nature and their love of nature and being close to nature. But they also like the Cynics, they although they were crazy about being, their contact with nature, they also like to spend time in cities. And Chicago had the main hub, was probably the main hub of hobo life around the turn of the last century.
Is that because it's a transport hub?
Because of the transport hub, because there was a lot of movement around. There was a lot of people who were working in forestry, in industry, and working on farms, or who when they got paid off, they headed into Chicago to spend their money. And there's a piece. So just a bit from the book I'm writing at the moment. They created these urban centers of their own within America's largest. And Chicago was its cultural capital and entertainment capital. At its peak, it estimated that there were 75,000 transients in Chicago's main stem, which centered for half a mile in every direction around West Madison Street. It was a city within a city, including cheap saloons, restaurants, flop houses, whorehouses, gambling dens, clothing, cigar and drug stores, but also bookstores, theatres, missions, and meeting halls, which provided evidence that many of the tramps, were cultured as well as from labouring classes. It was a huge thing in lots of the larger cities, but Chicago, was the sort of centre of that activity. But the people I was interested in were not people who were hobos or tramps from necessity. It was a lifestyle choice. That's the main difference about these guys who wrote their own life stories and philosophies and adventures. It was a lifestyle choice to live in that way. That's the link going back to the Cynics, the whole idea of asceticism, of living a simplest life as possible, as opposed to the majority of hobos who were looking for work.
Interesting. So, of the hobos that you read about and studied, what are maybe like the top 1 or 2 fascinating personalities or big stories that pop out at you of specific ones?
Okay. Well, you will have heard of Jack London. He's probably the most famous out of them. And he kind of barely crept in but when he started out his life, when he was a teenager, he was an oyster pirate, and he had his own sloop, and he used to.
What is an oyster pirate? It's like a poacher. It's like, that sounds like some type of euphemism, but
no, they were. Well, he worked in San Francisco Bay, and he just got oysters from. I mean, I'm talking, real oysters, and selling them and pirating them off other folk, But so when he was younger, his life was crazy life, and there's an episode where he's a really young guy, and he's got his sloop, and he's got a shotgun in one hand and the tiller of the boat in the other, and he's chasing down this mature pirate. And he wins the other guy bottles out, and then after that he did turn to riding the rails, and there's some great story. There's a story between him and Leo Ray Livingston, who's another tramp writer. They met. Livingston, he had a terrible youth, when he was like in about 13, 14 when he took off. He just took off and he went all over South America on his own, working, and then he goes back there later and he meets another young guy, and they go together. They do a trip all the way through the Amazon. They go through from the Amazon right the way through, and they travel with ponies. With burros at some point, and then they swap them for canoes, and they're going all the way down the river, and that's quite an amazing story. The other guy dies on the way from a snake bite, and he barely makes it himself. But when he's older, he puts an ad in one of the New York papers that he wanted a traveling companion to join him to go to do a coast to coast from the east to the west coast. And Jack London was like a teenager then. I think he was about 18, and they joined up, and that's before he wrote any of his books. But later on, Jack London does become a professional writer rather than that. His tramping career was fairly brief compared to a lot of these guys. I mean, the person who suppose impressed me the most was the only woman in the book, and it's not that there aren't women adventurers who've written their life stories, but Kathleen Phelan was on the road for 77 out of her 97 years. She lived to 97. She met up with her unmarried name was Newton, and she met up with Jim Phelan, who's another tramp featured in the book. He's an Irish guy, and they met up in North England, and they tramped together for about 24 years or something. And then when he died, she carried on tramping on her solo for a year, right up until she was into her 90s. She was tramping. She did a tramp all the way across North Africa, from Morocco through Tunisia, all the way through to Egypt, and then up into Turkey, and she ended up in the Himalayas, and then all the way. So that was a 3-year trip. She did solo with a basket on wheels with a few possessions in it, and that she's an incredible character. And so was her husband. He was 24 years older than her. Then Jim Tully, he's a guy who he ended up working in Hollywood with Charlie Chaplin. He was Charlie Chaplin's writer for a while. He had an amazing love. But one of the things that all these guys got in common is that they just don't take bullshit. They just say things like they are. They don't follow the rules. They everything's outside of the rules, and they just do whatever, they do whatever takes their fancy,
Interesting. What would you say? So obviously this is the type of thing that I think most normal people fantasize about at one time or another in their life. But usually they're held back. So the question I have is, what are the dangers that some of these people faced? I mean, the real ones. What were the downsides of doing this?
Well, in terms of beating trains, and a lot of them lost their lives, they lost limbs, thousands of people.
Running after trains.
Yeah, running out for trains, being beaten by train guards, all the rest of it. Most of them did jail time. Most of the guys I wrote about did quite a lot of jail time. They got, they got beaten up by people who are intolerant of their lifestyle. They starved, a lot of them. Some of them died of hunger, but not the guys I'm writing about, but a lot of those people, so it sounds romantic, the lifestyle, but there was a terrible price to pay for some of these people. And, one of the guys I write about, he was in the Rocky Mountains, and he just took out a gun and he was going to contemplate shooting himself. He'd had a gutful, They talk about the beauty of nature and that, but then they also talk about the harshness of it. So it's got the two sides to it. There was a very harsh side to the lifestyle, but there's a, as Catherine Phelan says, that the joy of it, the pleasure of it, the freedom of it far outweighed all the bad things that happened along the way.
So that was going to be my next question. I mean, what were the rewards other than the ones that you just said? I mean, clearly something was outweighing all that physical hardship. And was it just the sense of freedom or nature?
Yeah, the sense of freedom, the kind of thrill of it, the excitement of who they meet, what would be around the next bend. That nothing was predictable. They could. I guess for these folk, they couldn't cope with their ordered life that is predictable. They wanted, they just wanted to be out there and not know what was going to happen from one day to the next. They lived from just moment to moment, and some of those moments were great and some were not. But they that was a it was a philosophy as well, that they didn't believe in. It's like with the Cynics. Diogenes says about you don't owe anything to your parents. That you were just an accident at birth. And so had no loyalty to family. But then nor did Jesus, if you go
I was
back
just going to say that. I mean, Jesus says to follow me, you have to leave behind everything. And there's a lot of religious orders that say the same thing, Buddhist, Hindu. There's a ton. So that definitely does seem to be its own initiation to do that. And most people never do that. I mean, and whether that's good or bad, who am I to say? But I mean, there definitely are people throughout every historical period in culture, I think, who just kind of take off.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is a compulsive thing with these guys. It wasn't a choice. I mean, the more I read about it and go into it, I am convinced that it's a genetic. You're born a cynic. You cannot and a tramp. Those people who choose that as a lifestyle choice, they have to be born with that. It's not something they learn, or it's just a compulsive thing. And it's and the other thing is it's not like a religion or a political belief or any of those kind of evangelical movements. None of they didn't try and persuade other people to adopt their lifestyle or do what they did. It was just their own thing, and they just did it. And everybody else could take it or leave it.
Right. Well, one thing that did occur to me, I'm always hesitant to to do this, but since you mentioned that it was kind of compulsive and genetic for them, I'm wondering if there's some actual maybe diagnosis there. I mean, even or it could potentially be related at least in some cases. I mean, just the thing you mentioned about constantly needing to be on the move and not fitting in with the school system sounds like what would be diagnosed as attention deficit disorder now, particularly the constantly needing to be on the move.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of young people who are diagnosed with something like that, would much rather be running around in nature than in a classroom. Probably rightfully so in many cases.
I think it's probably got links. I wouldn't like to, but it's almost like it's almost like an autistic gene as well.
Okay.
That they're very much individual. These people are all individuals. They kind of shared the same ideas and they shared the same lifestyle. But the thing that marks them out is they're just total individualism. They were just not. They didn't belong to a tribe, although they identified with each other. But they didn't belong to a tribe or a religion or any group in society. They and like I said before, they weren't evangelical. They didn't try and persuade other people either to join them. It was just a compulsive behavior that they that they adopted.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I never want to play diagnostic. I think it's kind of offensive in addition to the fact that I'm no type of trained medical professional, but I can't help but see links and similarities. It does sound maybe a bit like a autism spectrum, potentially, and so it's probably different things and mixes of things in every case. But the thing about not having any sense of connection with other, not being total individuals, and the difficulty with traditional learning systems sounds like an autism spectrum thing. And of course, we know now with ASD, it's so much more complex and multivariate than what people thought even 10 years ago. Yeah. So it's different for every person.
Most autistic people don't necessarily identify with each other. They're all very much individualistic.
And people can be all, it's kind of like a music mixing board where the switches can be at different positions on all these different settings for each person.
I don't think there's any two autistic people the same, that I've met anyway. They are very much one-off individuals. They struggle with conforming to, they don't identify with kind of mainstream society in the same way as the tramps or the cynics did. They don't recognize it. They don't acknowledge it as legitimate even.
Which is a valid position, I think. It's that's a sane position on modern society. At least in my way of thinking.
It's like Nietzsche says. He says, why conform to rules that don't apply 200 miles away? And that's the difference between the cynics and and Plato and Aristotle, who believed in first principles of things. Just because something can be the law in. Well, not just in one country. I mean, some countries, certain drugs are illegal. In other countries, alcohol is illegal, and alcohol has massive impact on people's health and the cost of health services as well. But I mean, you just take the recent decision to overturn the abortion laws in your country, it's like, is it that one law is right and one's wrong, or who's in power at the time? And if you have a conservative, government in power, they will appoint conservative judges and they will create conservative laws. And it's random and it's not.
It is. Yeah. I mean, in that case, it was actually the throwing out of a law instead of creating a one. Yeah. That was probably not particularly well argued in the first place. And it just reverts to a states' rights things. It's not like abortion was made illegal, but it certainly has been in a lot of states. For instance, Texas, where I live. So it's like basically the country said, well, we don't have a good enough constitutional argument to take a federal position on it. It goes back to the states, and each state decided to make a clear position on it. So if you live in a conservative state,
which is even worse in a way, because there's no universal rights,
It is. Yeah. And the whole point of the Constitution is that there should be universal protections and rights. Anyways, that's a bit of a side issue, but yeah, I mean, I think
but it does identify one of the issues in terms of hoboism and tramping, which is that these folk do not recognize national boundaries. They do not recognize laws, cultural imperatives. That was of no importance whatsoever. They just felt it was anti-human almost.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's like, I think one of the things about often ASD people as well is in many cases, it's like if you tell them something and it doesn't make any sense and it's just an arbitrary thing, just the mental frustration is like, no, this doesn't make any sense. I'm not complying with this because it's not logical. So, yeah.
But the majority of people do comply because they live in fear of the consequences of not complying. It's more comfortable to comply sometimes, because if you put yourself into the margins,
well, you're vulnerable.
You then forego certain certain securities and things that the rest of us do when we buy insurance and we do all that stuff. We have a mortgage, and it kind of like we think we're creating a secure environment for ourselves, but actually we just become prisoners to big business most of the time in terms of well, I mean, it's kind of like pick your poison. It's like, do you want to live exposed, or do you want to buy into the lie and have at least some security? And I do think it is like that, though. I mean, in my lifelong ponderings of why people are the way they are. I mean, the majority of people at any time will simply just agree and comply with what the majority of people are saying, because it's like a school of fish, or a group of deer. It's like as soon as you stray, well, predators are going to get you. And if you're a school of fish and a shark shows up, even if it starts eating fish, statistically, you're less likely to be eaten. And so I don't think that the majority of people have thought through anything from first principles or any other philosophy, or even a political philosophy. They simply comply with what people around them are doing for herd safety. And it's a valid evolutionary strategy. But it's like, for certain people, that just does not work. It's like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. The hypocrisies are apparent. The body count of a society may be apparent, the evil that it does. And I think it's a universal desire for some people just to wash your hands of it and walk away. But even all the cultural norms and differences between different states, governments is like in conflict with multinational business, which is actually, the predominant factor in terms of the way we live our lives today. It's not about local politics or national politics or even international politics. It's about Amazon and all the other multinational corporations. They're the ones that are controlling our lives, controlling the media,
I think we're in a transitional phase away from this is a non-controversial argument, but we're in a transitional phase from the nation state to multinational or global corporate power. I think that's just not incontrovertible. I don't necessarily think it's even a bad thing. It's just another part of the process of the human history.
Absolutely. So back to the tramps.
Yes, yeah.
The other book I wrote published with Feral House was Jim Christie. What happened was, when I was researching for Kathleen Phelan, some relatives of her husband, Jim Phelan, put me in touch with Jim Christie as somebody who met Kathleen in the 70s on a boat from Spain to Morocco. And they tramped together for a few weeks and then parted company and went on their ways again. And so I got in touch with him to find out about Kathleen, but the more I spoke to Jim, I realized he had his own story to tell. And, I had to prize it out of him, but he had an amazing, incredible story.
What was that?
Well, he started off he lived in South Philadelphia and in a mafia family, and all his relatives, they were all involved in whatever the mafia were doing down there. And he was going along with it for a while. He was in that part of that culture, but he also, even at that point, he was wandering off into the black neighborhood and hanging around with those guys and just doing his own thing. And then something happened with his family, and they had to move out to the suburbs, and were given a false identity and everything. So I don't know whether that was to do with the police, whether it was to do with the mafia themselves, but they moved out into the suburbs, and he was always off tramping himself. He had the wanderlust thing, and he when he was 12, he hitchhiked from Philadelphia up to the Canadian border and met up with a guy who was an ex-Russian count who was tramping in the opposite direction, and they hung out together for a bit.
He was an ex-Russian count? What was the story there?
Well, when after the revolution, his family, their property was taken away, and he had to escape to get away from all that. But he met up with somebody later on in Canada who had been a servant of the family, and they got on fine. And but he just tramped. He was just tramping around, and Jim carried on tramping, and he traveled all over the world in the end. But he had multiple occupations, and he was a pugilist for a while. He did about half of the guys I wrote about were into that game as well.
Boxing.
And did prize fighting as a way of earning a bit of money when they were down and out. Jim became very politicized, and then when the Vietnam War was on, he was on the parade ground, and he just refused to. He just ignored all the orders, and he managed to escape to Canada in the end, along with thousands of other Americans. And he when he was in Canada, his first book was about was a collection of stories of all the guys, a lot of the guys he knew who'd escaped the Vietnam War.
That's really interesting. It's like, if you just look back through history, let's just say the 20th century, it is pretty clear to me that, like, the only unassailable moral, not only, but, in most cases, the unassailable moral position in hindsight is almost always to just take off on your own and be completely removed from the situation. Yep. For instance, Germany in the 30s and 40s, it's like the unassailable moral position there would have been just to take off and be a tramp. And then also I was, at a certain point I was doing a ton of research on genocide, and there's this thing, this is just a short diversion, and then I'll digress, but obviously everyone has this idea that if they were in Germany in the 30s or 40s, well, I wouldn't have complied. I wouldn't have been one of the people who did. Well, chances are, yes, you would have. And the only people historically that actually sheltered Jews or resisted the Nazi state were hobos, or people who were already out of society, who were living off in the woods. And had already disconnected from the society. Everybody else complied. That's very interesting to me.
That's my own background. My mother came over on the Kindertransport from Vienna in the 40s, and met my father. My father's English guy from a farming community. They met up, and then I was born in 1948.
Oh my God. Okay. Wow. All right. So
I'm 75.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, my wife wrote a book about my wife is a writer, and she met up with an Franco-American writer, Raymond Federman. I don't know if you've come across him.
No.
Look him up. Great guy. He's definitely a cynic.
Okay.
He passed away now, and he escaped the Holocaust. His family he was born in Paris, and his family were his mother and his father and his two sisters were taken to Auschwitz and killed. His mother shoved him into a closet in their apartment before they were rounded up, and he managed to get away. Went to the south of France, to the Vichy area, and worked on a farm for a bit. And he was 14. He came back, and eventually ended up in America. And all his life, he was trying to make sense of what happened to him. But his thing was laughter, he calls it. He just ridicules everything, and Angela, my wife, she wrote a book. The backbone of the book was a lot of emails between them. They're talking about different aspects of the Holocaust, but it's got an absurd side to it and a funny side to it as well, And they talk about Auschwitz Barbie and Auschwitz Lego and all this kind of stuff.
What did that mean? Well,
it's like the legacy of Auschwitz today. What's it mean? Angela's thing was the concentration camps, and we visited a few. And it's like, what are they there? What do they represent? What do people expect to find when they go there, and what's it mean? So she did a book. It's called Auschwitz, and it's all about Holocaust tourism, really. And how we make sense of it, or we don't make sense of it, how we can't make sense of it, and how it's still difficult to talk about without being sentimental, because there are still people alive today who are part of that, part of the Holocaust. But anyway, that's just because you mentioned Nazi Germany. So I got a bit of a background there.
I see.
As well.
Yeah, I mean, that recontextualizes things in terms of cynicism or tramping. I mean, particularly in time periods like that, history is usually bad. Society is usually bad, particularly then.
We're living in history now, aren't we? I mean,
yeah, and it's bad.
It's bad. It's pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess, maybe an argument, like actually a deeply moral argument, could be made there for tramping or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes, but I don't think today it's a lifestyle choice anymore. It was possible in the days when these guys did what they did and wrote about it to have that kind of lifestyle. But since the 1960s onwards, really, Jack Kerouac wrote about it in he did an essay, The Vanishing American Hobo, and he talks about, well, you can't even be alone in the primitive wilderness anymore because police helicopters will find you, and it's really hard to stay under the radar these days, much harder than it was, and people are more intolerant as well.
How so?
It was almost like accepted that people, the tramping lifestyle has been accepted for centuries, but in the last, 60, 70 years, it's kind of, there's lots of homeless people, but they're not tramps. They're homeless because of our circumstances. Very few people, I imagine, would choose tramping as a lifestyle today in the same way as those guys did when it was possible to do it. And there was like unwritten codes that you could live by as a tramp that don't exist anymore,
So what was it that changed? Just more development, more people, more surveillance?
Well, surveillance and CCTV and, anti-vagrancy laws. And, if you get caught without your vagrancy change, said Kerouac, you get locked up in the calaboose,
Do they still do that thing in London? I remember seeing several years ago, not several, but a few years ago, they were starting to put metal spikes on areas where people would be vagrant and sit on. So you couldn't even sit in public.
No, no, no. And then there's CCTV. You can be followed around the city. You can't. You're visible all the time. I mean, Britain's, I think, got one of the worst rates of CCTV cameras everywhere.
Yeah, I think London's the most surveilled city on the planet. There's literally nowhere you can be that you're not on camera, which is terrifying.
Yeah. And the level of ignorance and intolerance around that kind of lifestyle, there must be something wrong. You must be a drug addict. You must be some kind of criminal. You must, the cops will just harass you to death. And so it's not really an option anymore.
I wonder if there are places
it was.
I wonder if there are places in the world where it may still be an option. I mean, I just know, for instance, in the 60s, so many people went on the hippie trail in India. And I know people who went that from, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to England. And I wonder if maybe that is still possible in some places, or more possible. I don't know.
Well, not if you're, no. And I think it's disrespectful as well. There's something about, and I've seen it myself, there's something about white American and Europeans, particularly in third world countries, bumming around and begging. It just seems incongruous. There's something I can't quite get my head around that, but it goes on, and in Spain and places like that, the idea of Westerners tramping in, other parts of the world that are, worse off economically than ourselves is something I just don't get. I don't get that one at all, really. I mean, maybe you should be able to go where you want, but it's almost like disrespectful to those folk, because we come from a society where we are relatively better off financially and all the rest of it. And so it just doesn't seem right, I guess. But maybe that's my own prejudice.
It may have changed over time too. I mean, it's funny, when I was in India in the early 2000s, I was talking to somebody, and they were saying, it's like in the 60s and 70s, all the white people came over here and did drugs. Now they come here and sit in the internet cafes. So I think even at that point, that culture was pretty much done. I think it was more of a 60s thing. But, the broad point, though, is this is such an interesting topic to focus on, to look at how much freedom has been lost over the last several decades, how controlled things really are compared to even a few decades back. And it's, it's like millennials and younger have been raised in completely digital, controlled, air-conditioned, surveilled realities. And they're, and they're a different kind of person for the most part. They're domesticated, and they're, I think, as you're talking about, as you're writing about, I mean, there are times in American history where people were not domesticated. And even not necessarily tramps, but I mean, like, they were manual laboring. They lived a different type of life.
Oh, completely.
Kids grew up differently, playing in the street and that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, you can't walk down the street now that everybody's on their mobile phones. It's like everybody's, or they're on social media, or that, it's like it's so different, it's so alien. I mean, our kids laugh at us because we, don't buy into all that. Well, they don't particularly. They're not involved in social media that much. But I suppose we show our age now. Well, because people have stopped communicating. People don't meet up in face to face even.
It's terrible.
They find their partners on dating sites. Everything's online. The whole Instagram thing, and all those social media sites are just like, I don't know. What is that living? I don't know. I guess
no, I don't think so. I don't think so.
There's something very alien about it, if you're, So I don't know. We are a different generation.
Yeah.
And those people I wrote about were a different generation from my generation, very different. And that's the, well, it's either progress or or the opposite, depending on which way you want to look at it.
Right.
But,
what were the biggest differences in, when you say in that generation, I'm assuming you're talking about late 1800s, 1890s. What were the big cultural differences between then and your generation?
Well, I think on one level, there was less security in terms of, people had to literally fight for their lives.
When you say security, do you mean war or
well,
food?
Everything's covered now by, most people have once, we were all nomadic, and people didn't live in settled communities. Now everybody lives in settled communities. They live in houses. They live in communities, but are they communities? What sort of relationship do people have with each other where they live? Don't even know their neighbors.
Yeah.
So in those days, I guess on the one hand, you had real communities where people lived with and near their parents or family, and they knew the folk who lived around them. They could relate to them, or as the tramps did, they rejected all that and took off and did their own thing, created their own life. But now, we live in communities? I don't know if we do. There's some virtual communities out there, like the one you've created here. There are virtual communities, but physical communities, I don't know. I think that's the biggest difference in a way.
I think that podcasting is a very unique medium because although it is digital, it does have the sense of community. It's
face to face, human to human.
You and I are talking face to face, even if it's on Zoom, and probably 5,000-6,000 people are going to listen to this, and they're going to feel like they themselves are sitting listening to us talk. And it is a community of people that listen to the show, and I have a sense of who they are, and they write in, and it's a wonderful thing. And that really is a silver lining of the social media age, I think, is this format, which is why I do it, which is it has brought back long form conversation, which people didn't even do, prior to the internet, not in the same way, maybe in some cases, maybe at a bar, but probably not. They probably weren't that focused on a subject matter, at the bar. So it was different as well.
Yeah. There's so much, I don't know, superficiality now, but then that's just me. Maybe that's my own prejudice, but everything seems so superficial to me these days. And politicians are less and less, there was a time when I was younger, my parents were quite political. They were quite socialist as well. And people did seem to care about shit in those days and really fight for certain things and make things better. But today, I don't trust anybody. I don't trust any politician. They're a breed to themselves and everything. And I don't trust the medical profession. I think there's probably just as many people die from doctor-induced intervention as die from disease,
Yeah.
Or lack of intervention, because the other thing is it's getting harder and harder to actually get services, certainly in this country at the moment. Social care. My wife's parents both got dementia, and we're trying to desperately get them support, but we live like over an hour's drive away. We're relying on people going in to provide them with care, but those people aren't, they're not doing it because it's something they want to do. They're doing it because it's the only job they can get, and they're not very good at it.
Right.
And so, it's I don't know. But
this is the very grim side of modern life. And in the US, we don't have like a national health service, but if you do have to get care, you can end up destitute just because you needed medical care easily. It's so expensive here. And the medical industry is so corrupt in that way. It's one of the hugest issues with this country. But no, I do think that people are more superficial. I think they're superficial largely because they're afraid. I think that fear largely started in 9/11, but then became the fear of oh, somebody's going to say, attack me online. My words are going to be taken out of context. And politicians now, they're looking at focus groups and data and gathering and things like this. And they're doing guesswork of what they think people want and pandering to that. And
that's going back to the whole thing, the sort of cynicism versus the what is the status quo, which is kind of, Platonism, Aristotelianism, that kind of, that, like, the medical profession is I mean, most doctors in this country are just pimps for the drug companies.
Yeah, here too.
And people have to struggle to go. People have to, if people want to, I mean, like, most things can be sorted. A lot of health problems can be sorted out by if you're on the right diet, you have the right lifestyle, all those. But they never talk to you about that stuff. They just write a prescription for something that actually has got lots of side effects. My wife and myself are both nurses in the dim and distant part, so we've seen both sides of it, And when I retired as a director of adult social services 11, 12 years ago now, and things have changed. Even in that short time, things have changed so much.
How so?
Well, mostly now, the statutory services put most of their effort into avoiding giving people services rather than providing services.
Oh, what do you mean by that? That's
well, you have to go through all these hoops to get, and most people just give up. That if you want to make a complaint these days, you have to go through layers and layers and layers of processes, follow all these rules and things. You have to fill in all these forms, and if you've got the stamina to continue with it, is a miracle. Everything is designed to wear people down, because more and more people are complaining and are not satisfied with the kind of services, we're provided with. Now, the latest thing is the water boards in this country were all privatized. So, water, which should be it's a basic need and a basic necessity. They are saying they're going to have to spend, I don't know, 10 billion or something on rebuilding all the sewers and everything. But they're going to do it by putting up water bills, when they should have been doing it for the last few decades. And instead of which, shareholders are just taking, just making money out of it. Oh, I mean, it's like every part of the public sector is like that. And I suppose those are the kind of things, in a way, that being a tramp or a hobo, you just got away from. You couldn't tolerate that kind of thing. Yeah. Although it's worse now than it certainly was then in some ways.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing I suppose people chose to escape from.
So I'm really
not having to.
Yeah, it can be tempting. So I'm curious, like, what are some of those who did choose this, of the tramps that you studied? What are some of the kind of the craziest stories that you read, or some of the most outstanding things in your memory of events or adventures that some of these people had, or dangerous moments, like kind of cinematic moments?
Yeah, well, like I said, Kathleen's trip, 3-year trip on her own with a basket on wheels, was incredible for a woman. Well, not even a Western guy would do that trip nowadays. Be impossible. She spoke about 13 languages. She, picked up throughout her life, and she's an incredible character. She got by. That's how she got by. But she talked about being in America as well. She was there for some years, and talks about being kicked off the subway, seated in the subways and stuff like that. She was treated worse in the US than she was when she was traveling across Africa and places like that.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, I just so many. I would just say, if you're interested, read the book.
Okay.
I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker, and it's like the stories just speak for themselves. But like Leo Ray Livingston's trip across Central and South America, just incredible. Jim's stories are just incredible. oh, it's like there's so many stories. It's where do you even start?
Or maybe any that just happened to float to mind.
I'm just trying to think.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Morley Roberts. He came over on a ship from the UK to America, and he was just a kid at the time, and he was being treated really badly by by the regular crew on the ship. And at one point, he was down on the ground, and this guy, oldest sailor, was just kicking him, and he just waited his moment. He waited to recover from seasickness and all the rest of it. And then when he did, he got his own back. He just waited his moment, and then he just floored the guy, and he carried on doing prize fighting and stuff when he got over to America. There's a guy, Tom Cromer, and he's probably one of the few guys who probably was partly forced into tramping through circumstances rather than choice. And he talks about being so hungry that he talks about planning to mug people to get their wallets off them, and it talks about standing outside restaurants watching people just really not enjoying a meal, having all this food and just like really not even taking any notice of it. And he's like hadn't eaten for days, and he was starving to death. And at some point he agrees to have sex with some other guys who just for money, He got so desperate. I mean, some of them did get that desperate. A lot of the younger guys, they got involved with older tramps. This Josiah Flint is one of the few who actually wrote about that side of it, the exploitation between older tramps and some of the young kids. But that's not.
There's a song about that? Big Rock Candy Mountain, I think, was originally about that. Pedophilic older tramps, I think, if I'm correct in that.
Yeah, I mean, some of them had great relationships with older tramps. Some of them were exploited either sexually or they got them to involve them in criminality and stuff to get money for them. But the guys and some of the guys that I wrote about had been through that, but they overcame that. They survived. They were real survivors, some of these guys.
One thing I did want to ask you about is the hobo symbols. The kind of symbols that they had their whole own almost occult symbolic language of if I'm remembering correctly, of kind of symbols drawn on fences. And I always remember being very kind of mystified and impressed by that whenever I heard about it. Is that something that you looked into?
Yeah. There's some illustrations of the symbols in the book. Obviously, the American ones are different from the English ones or British ones. They vary, but most often they were in Britain. They used to leave all these warning signs when other tramps would approach villages to say, "Well, this is a good place, this is a bad place. Don't go here," or whatever, or indicating where they should go, where they shouldn't go. In the US, it was mainly on the railway lines and on the big on the wooden water towers. They leave symbols to say who they were, where they were going, what direction they were going in, so people could sometimes link up with each other or follow each other. It's a bit like tagging today, I suppose, in a way. It's like an early version of that. But yeah, they had recognizable symbols. They were very simple designs, but they knew what they were.
Is there any record of how that got started?
Well, like anything else, I suppose, it just somebody starts doing it, passes it. People just learn from each other. There's it was just done from necessity, I guess, and then it developed into a code that was recognizable across the country.
That's so interesting.
And they also had their own language for things as well. They had like with criminals. They have their own codes and their own language.
Yeah, that is super interesting too. I mean, I know that for a long time, gay people in England had their own language, the Polare.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if there's any survival of that now. I know a lot of those words have just entered common speech. But that has always fascinated me. I mean, just the whole idea of not even just subcultures, but what is even more interesting to me is paracultures, like cultures that are their own world that is not existing as part of or in reaction to the mainstream culture, but is just happening at the same time under the radar. And this, I think, is an example of that. And when it gets to the point where they have their own symbols and language, I mean, this is just fascinating to me.
Well, like the Cockney rhyming slang in London,
Yeah. The question I want to kind of start to come to a close on here is, does this culture, are there survivals of this today? I mean, obviously we've been talking about how hard it is, but there must be something like this today.
I don't think so. I don't think...
Really?
I really don't
even
think
because there's such a homelessness epidemic everywhere that
but that's because that's not through choice. That's through just necessity. People are homeless. There are few people. They are people. The people. And the people who've got money obviously can get camper vans. And travel and do stuff. Stuff like that. There's, this whole groups of people out there in the States who live in camper vans and meet up and all the rest of it. But there are still people who beat trains now, but there's so few and far between. It's like, it's not a cultural phenomena in the way it was back in those days. Certainly not. I don't know, people... I'm trying to think what the equivalent would be nowadays. And I don't think there is, because I don't think people are able to go under the radar in the way those guys did.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a dark point to come out of this podcast, but it or maybe it's not dark because it points at a problem that should be solved. I mean, I think that the lack of anonymity for people is extremely psychologically bad. For a lot of reasons. You need to be anonymous, at least at times. There need to be some places you can go where the whole world's not watching. But I don't know, maybe there's examples of other things that people do that you've seen now to kind of, maybe if they're not riding the rails, but they're getting out from under the thumb of the system other ways. I don't know.
Well, I think people are doing it online. People are expressing themselves. I mean, one of the great things about the internet is that people are able to communicate with other people so much more easily, and you don't need to be published anymore either. I mean, it's probably more writers out there now than there are readers. I think people have a really short attention span for reading.
Yeah, people can't read anymbut it's another
they
dark
just like this quick sound bites and images, and that's a sad thing in a way, but it's true. And I don't know. When all the places the trouble is the places I traveled to, and it's this a need for the exotic. Trader Horn had it. He's one of the guys in the book. Trader Horn was a British guy who, when he was in his teens, he went to Central America and worked for a company that traded in ivory and rubber and all the rest of it. And he ended up as a tramp in South Africa and was discovered. I don't know if his life's been made into a movie as well.
What movie was that?
He ended up living rough in Johannesburg and just going around houses selling kitchenware and stuff like that, he would have probably just died. But he ended up at this woman's house, and who happened to have the same interest in Viking history as him, and they got chatting, and he started telling her his stories, and then in the end, they, her and her husband wrote it all up. He published 3 books then in the end, and he's got a very idiosyncratic way of telling his stories, but they're just phenomenal. And he partly fictionalizes a lot of these guys as well. They do, and the same goes to Cynics. There's a whole kind of literary tradition that is the fact and fiction just gets completely blurred, and they deliberately lay all these traps and scenarios where you're guessing, but they don't care, and he didn't. He had this story about. He made a story about this woman, this white goddess who gets captured by this tribe in the Goey River, and how he has to rescue her from. It's all a bit like Rider Haggard kind of stuff, but it's all based on fact. And the thing is that a lot of these stories, when you get to the facts, they're more fantastic than the fiction quite often.
Yeah,
they're just so bizarre. Some of the things these guys did. He's a real character. But when I was younger, I had this need there's this need for the exotic, for difference, for things that feel different from what you're used to, and going for things that are, kind of exotic. Is the word. And I went to Africa I went to Africa for a couple of years when I was 19. I was there close to 21, and when I came back, I was never the same. I could never settle because the culture shock wasn't going there. The culture shock was coming back to Britain after being there, and that thing. And I've worked in Honduras and in Latin America and various places, but I've always been in places where I stand out. Like the thing about most of the tramps and hobos, they are part of they did what they did in their own communities, and didn't necessarily stand out differently. And a lot of people who do travel now, they tend to go to places where you do stand out because you just look. People immediately recognize you're not a local, and that kind of that takes some of the pleasure out of it as well, because you can't just merge and really be part of the culture. You're always going to be an outsider.
Got it. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for talking to me. Let's. I want to wrap up. Please tell people where about your 2 books and your other books and where they can get them, or where they can find out more about you.
Okay. Well, there's a profile I've got a profile on Amazon. So on Amazon Books, so that people can look that one up under the book. So the books are, the first book I published was Cynicism, From Diogenes to Dilbert, and that's published by McFarland Press in the US. And then the last 2 books are published by Feral House, is Jim Christie, A Vagabond Life. And then the second book is, it's got a hell of a long title. It's the Lives and Extraordinary Adventures of 15 Tramp Writers from the Golden Age of Vagabondage. That's the title of the book. But if they just look up Ian Cutler and find those books. Well, I just hope people enjoy them, because I certainly enjoyed writing them. I'm not doing it I don't write for notoriety or for money or anything. I've got a pension. I'm quite comfortably off now. And it's just a labor of love, and it's just something I got obsessed with and fascinated with. And
wonderful.
So,
well, thank you so much for talking to me. This is a great show. All right, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us on the adventure. And remember to check out our new course, The Magick of Tarot, with Lon Milo Duquette. That's at tarot.magick.me, tarot.magick.me. It's a comprehensive course that promises not just to educate, but to transform your life. Don't miss out on unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Sign up for the Magick of Tarot now and join the growing community of magicians finding joy and profound insight in the course. So until next time, hang in there, lots of love, and I will see you soon.